Ruby.
Bueno, no me anda el aparatito para cliquear, así que voy a estar caminando. Esto es RubyConf Uruguay. Esto es todo repetido lo que dijo Foca, bueno, de Buenos Aires, Argentina.
So I come from Buenos Aires, Argentina. This is my Twitter sovereign, my GitHub user. And what I want to speak about today is to show you some of the tools I use, one that I don't use at all, and tell you about some of the ideas behind these ideas. If you're interested in exploring it more, you're not forced to use everything. These are not recipes that you have to use like I show them. The first one, the first tool, is a tool to do parsing in the command line. If you want to do a creation like Rails or Git, here you can do parsing with the flags. One of the advantages of Ruby, because it is object-oriented, is that the anonymous functions respond to arity, which returns all the parameters. For example, this lambda receives one parameter. The idea of clap is that instead of defining which flags you want to put and the amount of parameters you're going to receive directly, you obtain this with the lambda you give. So you can configure a command with function with a command line. The flag is like a hash, and the hash value is just the function that you want to execute. Clap will be in charge of working with all the parameters, and if there are not enough parameters, it will show an error that is to be expected. And this is a tool that is not as complete as the one that comes in the standard Ruby library. There are millions of alternatives. There's about 20. 19 are more popular than clap. But I use this because I think it's very simple and easy to use. And the issue of arity, it's not an exclusive function of this, but you can also use it in any Ruby method. This is a specific example. If you were to receive in the command line -r, a name, a file, -v, then you could print a version then. And this would be a more specific use. You include in a module a set of methods, and then we extract the methods from that module so that you don't have a series of lambdas there that produces too much noise. The second library that I wanted to show you is GS. Some of you probably heard about GS. Most of you use Bundler, and this tries to isolate the dependency of a project. So when I start a project, for example, I have a foo project, I create the directory, and I do an init, a GS init. And this gem set declares a couple of variables, GS name, and it will tell me in which. You know what a gem set is? Well, a gem set is a space where you can install gems. If you declare anything, then Ruby Gems installs a global space. So if you have 20 projects, you might have problems. You have to require a gem because a project might require a gem prior to the one you had, or there are multiple gems of the same kind that have been installed. So they have different types of solution. One is the one that Bundler does, which you can declare for each project what gems you're going to use. And Bundler is a bit tedious, and you have to use the execution time, so that adds 5 mega of your memory. So gem set, this GS gem creates a space to install those gems. So on one side, I prepared this variable, and it creates a directory. Now I have a directory that is .gs. Whenever I do gem install of anything, that gem Whenever it installs, it will end up in this directory. So if I do the same with all my projects and install gems in the global space, I won't have any problem that it will require install a gem that it requires. So those are things that are resolved by bundler. And when you eliminate a project, then I remove the directory, and that's it, and the gem is gone. Many of you, well, bundler with gem file, this became like a standard, and people like myself who don't want to use bundler are forced to have a gem file if you want to send your application to Heroku. So this is an app that makes a list of all the installed gems and generate a gem file, instead of doing what bundler does, which makes you define the gem file and the gem, and then you have the list. So this is useful only for myself, not for anyone else. And you use it in this way, gem file. It is redirected to a file, and with this I can send the file to Heroku. Next. You know that Rails and Padrino have code generators. You generate a form, file structure, and Lucas F. said, well, I want to generate a form and I have to do this by hand. So at one of the meetings we had in Argentina, we prepared this program. And you can install templates. This would be a template to prepare a gem. And this shows where the files will be and which files you will be installing. And to execute this, you generate a gem. And when you execute this command in the default editor, you have a file that is a plan. And it has certain classes, and for each class you have a file will be created in the destination that you configure. And then you'll have files that coincide with the name of the class, where you specify in RB the variables that you want to include. The destination I put here is a mandatory method that you have to have in the class, but you can define the name of your project, the version, or whatever. So when you save this file, you have all the files of that template. So whenever I have to start a new project, I put gn app. And this creates one in the web server I use and the gems that I used. I can have if it is an app API that does not require user authentication. So I'm explaining this very rapidly so that you can get a notion of what all this is about. But this is what Lucas now uses to use. Another gem is OST. Most of you probably use delayed job or rescue or sidekick. And all these are forms of having parallel jobs in any web apps. In this app, you can have an action. For example, sending an email. We can do this in a synchronous way and block the request and send the email. But when we need to scale this app, we send it through Redis to a worker, and the worker executes this. And OST allows you to do this. You could send a job and serialize it, but the philosophy of OST is to only send data. This is an email. And instead of using the option mailer, send, etc., and then picking this up, and I do .perform or rescue or in Sidekick, here I send an email, then welcome is the name of a queue I'm using, and then I'm sending the email. I take out the elements from that queue, and I do whatever I want to do. For example, send an email. One of the advantages of using this paradigm of sending data and not finished tasks is that in the case of using rescue or sidekick, the logic of the application of the mailer is still in the application, and it has to be in Ruby. Now, in this case, the worker, which is of Ruby, as it is only a convention as has a list of readies, I can do this with Python or with any other. And
if the worker dies, a list of Ruby with this name will save the error. It's like the backup. So this is formed by host, then the name of the queue, the host name of the worker that died. And so it's easy to do forensic to see what was going on. I think that comes with Psychic Pro, and all the rest died. This is the library that unfortunately I'll never be able to use. You know that in Ruby, if you have the one version of foo, which is a brilliant idea, and then the two, and for some specific issue, I need to use one for some things and two for another. It's impossible. If I use the two versions, then the last one wins. I won't be able to make the two of them coexist. But then, with this gem, I can import version 1 in one model, in a foo1 version, and then foo2, and I can use the two in the same application. And this, what makes this work is we are very used to using require called load behind, and this parameter that of load that we almost never use tells us that if we wanted to load all that file in an anonymous or not. And so here it tells true, so that everything will be loaded in a new module. That's why we can assign another constant afterwards. And in the libraries, for instance, in foo1 and foo2, you would have to add this line that says export foo. So what I'm exporting here is what I'll be importing from the other, a constant, a rail, or whatever. And it's a library that nobody will ever use, because all the libraries would have to do this, and unless Ruby Gems comes in a new version that will tend to use these models, that's something that won't happen. And it's not something that would improve our work a little, it would improve it a lot. It has Python, Node, almost all the languages have it, and we are the only precarious ones that can't use two versions of the same library. And the last library that I wanted to show you, I think it was last year that there were many problems with the validation of Rails, with the attribute accessible, that you could send more or less things. Something that happened to us as years went by working at this is that not always do you want to use the same validations or the same attributes in different places. An example that I have here, for instance, is that, let's assume that I have a model that is a post. If I want to avoid the post, when I interact with that post, I'm going to show the body to the editor. Let's assume that the attributes are body and status. Status may be draft or published. And when I interact with body, I just wanted to present this data. When I am sent the form, I would load it in this, and I will validate that the body is there. I don't worry about the status. When I receive the data, I check whether it's valid. If it's valid, I can send the attributes to the module that may have no validation. When in another part of my application I wanted to publish that post, I can just expose the attribute status. So if somebody wants to sell me, for instance, a body attribute, then the app clashes, but that won't get to the model. The issue is that body was not defined here as an attribute. They don't even know what the model is like. And this way, you can take all the attributes of that front end and put them together in that. That's the only one that has access to the database. If you wanted to do this with SQL, for instance, you would have to put a status in the post and validate based on that status. So, for instance, I would have to say, validate the presence of this or that if I'm in a certain context, or validate the presence of body if I'm in a certain context. So it's not easy. And this is quite a decent way you can avoid that problem. So this is a list of the gems that we saw. You're not meant to use them, it's just as an explanation. And I wanted to show you quickly the code of each of them. The GS code, gem file, GN, OST, cargo, load, no, cargo, and Scrivener. Well, if you liked any ideas, you can enter the code, you can read them in 15 minutes. That should be enough. And then you can get some ideas to create some things, changes in OST, etc., changes in Scrivener. Thank you.